grateful to introduce a good friend and a really important voice in discussions about the future of high school education here in the United States, Dr. Sarah Fine. Dr. Fine began her own career teaching English and serving as an instructional coach in Washington, D.C. She actually returned to her alma mater to pursue her doctoral work in education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. The research that she did during that time would become the subject material for her book, and her very highly acclaimed book, entitled In Search of Deeper Learning, The Quest to Remake the American High School, which she co-authored with Harvard faculty member Dr. Jal Mehta. It's also the subject of what you'll be hearing about today. Currently, Dr. Fine, she directs a program at High Tech High's Graduate School of Education. It's a teaching apprenticeship program. So she serves as the director for that, and as if that wasn't enough, she also teaches doctoral level classes at UCSD in educational leadership. So she's a very busy person. We're incredibly grateful to have you here today. Dr. Fine, thank you for coming. Please join me in giving her a big welcome.
So before I start, I'm just curious, because I know we have a mix in here, how many of you are parents in this community, and how many of you are teachers? And is there anybody else other than Carrie? Admin? Okay, that's helpful. I was like, I think I need to do a different talk for teachers than a talk for parents, but then I realized there's going to be a mix, so I'll try to kind of cut in between how I might share this data for those two audiences. So, I'm going to start with some bad news, which may well be familiar to you and resonate with some of the experiences you have or not. And so I should also say that I'm very much a public school person. I actually haven't had a lot of opportunities to talk to private school audiences, so I'm really excited about this, and I would love your feedback at the end about where you think that I could tailor this presentation to be most relevant to private school audiences. Because I don't think that there's a hugely bright line between what happens in public schools and private schools, but there are obviously important differences. So I'll just kind of frame with that. So we know a couple of things about teenagers in the United States who are enrolled in school, and none of them are things to be particularly happy about. So we have a lot of big scale data that tells a pretty bleak story about the experience of teenagers at the schools on the whole. So we know from a Gallup poll that was done a couple of years ago of more than 1 million students that while only a third of fifth graders say that they don't enjoy school, so almost 2/3 do, by 11th grade, 75% of 11th graders are saying that they are bored and disengaged on a daily basis from school. We also know from observational studies of classrooms in the United States, so the Measure of Effective Teaching study done by the Gates Foundation was one of the biggest ever observational studies of classrooms. We know that on the one hand, classrooms are generally pretty well managed, so it's not like Blackboard jungle everywhere the way that we might imagine in terms of schools that we think about as kind of chaotic places. But on the other hand, 4 out of 5 classrooms are places where kids are mostly doing pretty low-level cognitive work. They are not being asked to engage in rich intellectual tasks. They are not being asked to do work that is particularly engaging or meaningful or challenging for them. And then this last piece of data I added, I just came across this, but it unfortunately tells a similar story about schools that might mirror the demographics here a little bit more. So there was a study recently done of high school students who are in fairly elite public high schools, so sort of in elite suburban communities like La Jolla, for example. And those students, similarly, 49% of them said that although they work hard and spend a lot of time on their homework, they feel stressed out and they do not find much value or meaning in the work that they're doing. And so we might take issue with that data around challenge in classrooms, but the data that says that kids aren't really connecting to their schoolwork, I would argue there's a picture here that sort of crosses the private and public school divide to some extent. So the good news is that we know that teenagers are not inherently disengaged from the world, right? So all of you work with or live with teenagers, right? So you know that when a teenager finds a reason to engage, like if you're having an argument or a debate with a teenager, they are stunningly passionate. right? In fact, they are like far more passionate than most of us can muster as adults. They will hang on when they believe something, with their life. And we have examples worldwide of teenagers who are at the forefront of some of the most important movements that have been going on in the last decades. And so we know that teenagers can engage when they choose to. And more than that, that they're hungry to be real participants in adult life, and that when they see a reason to step up, the results of them stepping up are often sort of more than we might even imagine. And we have some brain science that backs that up. So we know that although executive function, so decision making, kind of matures in the sort of late adolescence or even early adulthood, that on the other hand, the teenagers' abilities to think in complex ways, so changes to the frontal cortex where we reason and analyze, those are pretty much mature by age 15. And so we know that teenagers are ready to do complex work. And we know that they're ready to do complex thinking. And we also know that they're hungry to take risks, right? And on the one hand, that can result in behaviors that we're not so thrilled about, right? Like classically, teenagers are always asking, like, what would happen if I try X or Y? And sometimes X or Y are sort of like, antisocial behaviors we're not thrilled about. But that what would happen if mindset is actually really important. They are curious about themselves, about the world, about themselves in engagement with the world. And so there's all kinds of levers we could be pulling with teenagers to get them engaged. And we know that once they're engaged, they are really capable of a lot. So the mismatch between what's happening in schools and what teenagers are capable of is really tragic on the whole. And so we know that the world we live in, especially right now, is incredibly complex. It's more than just complex, it's very uncertain. I saw in your sign on the way in something about like preparing students for a world, in a workforce we can't even imagine, and that's never been truer than now, right? None of us know what the world is going to look like in 20 years when our current teenagers are sort of into their careers. And we know that there's a huge amount, a very large number of very complicated questions that our teenagers have to sort of make choices about now. So it's not just about where they get to later, but think about navigating college, trying to make decisions about loans, about sort of best fit, about for kids who may not come from college-going families, is a 2-year college the right place to start? What about a 4-year college? It's just this very complex matrix. Think about the climate crisis and the decisions we have to make as individuals about the decisions we have to make at the ballot box, as well as individual decisions about how we navigate and make sense of this like wilderness of news we're getting. And obviously, when we're making decisions as voters, it just feels to me sometimes like there's so much competing information, even as a highly educated adult who thinks I have been sort of like equipped to handle it. It still feels like more than I can handle in terms of sort of making sense of what's out there. So how do we expect teenagers who are not even getting asked to think in complex ways in their high school classrooms to make those choices? So Brenna kind of alluded to this. I started my career as a high school teacher, and I was working at a very authoritarian school, at a sort of no excuses school, if you're familiar with that world, in DC. And I thought that we as a school were doing a decent job by our students because most of our students were getting into college and were getting into 4-year colleges, which for that demographic was kind of a big deal. But over the 4 years I spent there, I realized that our kids were not actually making it through college, because I stayed in touch with a lot of students. In fact, very few of them were making it through college. Most of them were leaving within the first year, if not, some of them weren't matriculating at all. And I started to question what it was we were equipping them for, because it felt like, we had done okay on state tests, but really they clearly weren't kind of ready to negotiate and navigate sort of life outside of high school. And I started having all of these questions about like, what is the purpose of schooling, and what are we doing for our children, and what about these children? And I did what all reasonable humans do when they're confused. I left and went to graduate school. That's what you do, right? When you're like, I don't know what to do, I'm going back to school. Or what you do when you're a privileged human who can afford to do that. So when I got there, I encountered the gentleman who's now my co-author, Joel Mehta, who was at the time a junior professor, and we realized we were asking a lot of the same questions. So both of us were kind of troubled by the fact that a school could produce high test scores on state tests and still have kids who weren't really able to think, and still have students who weren't making it through college, and there was this mismatch between what at the time in the early 2000s was kind of thought of as sort of the important part of schooling, getting kids to pass tests at high rates, and what we saw in the world, which didn't seem to match up with that. So we were like, what does it mean to be a good school? Because right now, we see schools that are being categorized as good, like the one that I was teaching at, but I don't think we're doing well by our students in terms of actually equipping them for the life that they're going to lead and the world they're going to have to navigate. So he was asking very similar questions. His frame was that something about focusing on test scores had kind of sort of opened a conversation about how we make sure all kids are getting enough in terms of foundational skills, but it had kind of constrained the conversation about what is goodness in schooling writ large? What does it really mean to be good beyond just those sort of numerical indicators? So we were kind of troubled by the same stuff, and we were asking the same questions, and so we decided to sort of go out there and see what was out there. And what we thought at the time was, if we just kind of asked around and we found out from people who were in the know what are the best schools in the United States, ideally schools serving sort of a wide population of kids, what are they doing? Like, what is their magic? What's their secret sauce? We thought if we found those schools and we visited them and we spent a bunch of time there observing and listening, we could write up some case studies that would be kind of inspiring and useful and maybe help to like crack open that conversation again about sort of forms of goodness in schooling that is beyond just like sort of numerical scores. That was our assumption. It was wrong. So we, in 2010, started this project, and we thought, okay, this will take us like a year or two. We'll go see a few schools. We'll write up some case studies. It's going to be great. It took us 8 years. We ended up visiting 30 different schools. It took us 10 years, really, to produce the book that came out of this work. And the problem, at least at first, was that we didn't find what we were looking for. We had kind of naively assumed that there were like schools with answers out there. And so we started going to some of the places that were really recommended to us. And while there was lots of very good work going on in those places, which I'll share about in a little while, it just wasn't like with the level of consistency and clarity that we assumed we would find. And so we realized sort of in retrospect, we made some assumptions that were wrong. And as we worked through those, we began to actually kind of make some sense that seemed useful. So I put up a photo of the Odyssey because it feels, or not a photo, a painting, because it sort of started as like a project and it turned into this like quest, right? Where I'm not even sure if we quite found what it was we were looking for in the end. So the first mistake is we thought that the most innovative, disruptive, high-flying schools that had the national reputations would be the ones with the answers. And so those were the schools that we started off going to. And as I will describe a little later, there were some interesting things to be learned from those places. But on the other hand, the patterns we encountered in classrooms in those places were surprisingly similar to the data that you saw at the beginning. So what we would do when we went to a school for the first time is we would each choose a student to shadow for the whole day. And a couple times during the day, we would sort of huddle together to share what we were seeing and then sort of break back up. So we really got a sort of students level perspective of what was happening. And the problem was we would go to these like innovative high-flying schools and there would be lots of cool stuff going on. But when we would get back together after a few hours to describe the classrooms we had been in, they were on the whole classrooms where kids didn't know why they were doing what they were doing. They were sitting and sort of somewhat passively taking in information. They were filling out worksheets. They were listening to lectures. They were doing tests. We asked them to kind of regurgitate what they knew. And when we said like, okay, what's going on here? What's the purpose of your task? Most of them would say, yeah, I don't know, it'll help me get into college, or it's in the textbook, or my teacher told me to. Or in some cases, students would just say, I don't know, I'm just doing it because they told me to. And so the patterns there are very consistent, right? We know that that is something that happens across a lot of schools in the United States, but we were at these like innovative schools where we assumed the pattern would be different. But instead, what we noticed was the data showed us it was very similar in the sense that maybe 1 or 2 out of every 5 or 6 classrooms was different and had something really interesting going on. Kids had different answers about, why are you doing this and what is the work that you're being asked to do here. But really, 1 out of every 5 is roughly compatible with what the Met study found, right? Which is like, there are classrooms out there where there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, but they are the exception, not the rule. So that was true here. which made us kind of wonder about what does it mean to be an innovative school or a leader school if we're seeing a lot of the same patterns that we would be seeing in other places. And then the second assumption we had made from the very start was that the place to look for really powerful learning that was sort of intellectually rich and more engaging, where kids saw a purpose and were doing interesting things with their brains and maybe even with their hands, that the place that could happen was academic classes. And so when we first set out to collect this data, we spent a lot of time shadowing kids through their sort of core day, and we didn't pay much attention to the other stuff. The pattern that emerged was when we asked kids, we would sit down in the cafeteria at lunch, and we would say, like, when in your day do you feel like you care about what you're doing, you have a really clear purpose, you feel connected, you are sort of internally motivated? They would say, oh, well, that's my art class. Or that's my theater production after school, or that's school newspaper, right? Or that's my elective on, I don't know, philosophy of literature, or something like that, right? It was all these spaces that are sort of ubiquitous. They're everywhere at high schools, right? We have the American high school, regardless of whether it's public or private, has academics, and then it has all this other stuff, right? We have sports, we have clubs, electives. But we tend, as researchers and scholars and even policymakers, to ignore the other stuff. It's like peripheral. It's somehow not at the center of what we care about with schooling. And we don't measure what's going on there. We don't make policies to regulate what's going on in those spaces. And yet kids were telling us over and over, like, those were the spaces that had some of the qualities that we were interested in finding. And so we started to realize very slowly, because when you go in with a mindset, it like takes a while to like get out of that rock brain where you're like, oh, okay, actually we should be looking somewhere else for the thing we want to find. That those spaces were interesting and worthy of research. So we ended up moving, we continued to look at academic classes, and I'll circle back to that. But we ended up spending a lot of time in some of these peripheral spaces because we started to realize that those spaces were a whole lot more promising in terms of powerful, rich, engaging learning than some of the academic spaces that we were seeing. And so I'm gonna dig into an example for a little while with you, and then at some point I'm gonna pause and ask you to make some sense of what I'm saying. And then I'm going to circle back to the question about, like, what does this have to say about core academics? Because we continue to care about those too, right? We're not trying to argue that, like, core academics, let's just throw them out the window. It's more like, okay, if this other set of spaces has some solutions out there, what can we learn from them? So the example I'm going to give is from a school that is as close to this school as exists in our study. So the pseudonym we gave it was called Achievement High. It's a large, elite, suburban public school. So it's public, but the population, the demographic it serves, most parents have a college education, fairly affluent community. It's known as, kind of like an analog would be like La Jolla High or Torrey Pines High. So it's a large suburban high school. And so this is the sort of rough transcript of what happened during an English class that we observed at the end of the day one day. This was a college prep level English class, so it wasn't AP, but it was, it was like, I don't know, the third of 4 tracks. We'll talk about tracking later. And if you take a look at what was happening, the students were studying Hamlet. I have nothing against Hamlet. I'm a high school English teacher. I love Shakespeare. I think we should teach Shakespeare. But the way in which kids were engaging with Hamlet was very shallow and very much sort of echoed all the other ways that we saw high school English classes playing out at other schools. And so there was a little quiz at the beginning of the class. I think the election was coming up. This was maybe 2016. The quiz was not at least sort of articulated to be connected to what they were supposed to be doing. There was like 4 or 5 minutes where the teacher introduced us as guests, even though we told the teacher, like, please just let us kind of, be flies on the wall. But we got the strong sense, like, I don't know, the time had to be filled, so let's do that. And then the teacher showed 3 different clips of Hamlet's famous to be or not to be soliloquy of 3 different film versions of Hamlet. Now, I have done this, right? I love comparative film analysis. Like, there is so much richness there. But what happened was the teacher showed these clips very quickly. Students had nothing that they were asked to be doing during that time. And then there was 5 minutes of discussion. of the differences among these clips. 5 minutes. And so as you might imagine, the discussion was extremely shallow. It was mostly the teacher kind of like pulling some thoughts from, how is Kenneth Branagh different from Mel Gibson? And then, then very quickly the teacher handed out a worksheet. There was a matching worksheet where it was like, here are some Shakespearean English and here are some sort of modern English translations. Match the quote to the modern English translation. The kids did that, then told them their homework, and they were off for the rest of their day. Now, kids are doing something in this class, right? It wasn't chaotic. Kids weren't, throwing spitballs at the teacher. It was reasonably well managed. But it echoed all of those patterns that I just described, where there's not a lot of cognitive work going on. There's lots of opportunities for it, right? There's content, there's interesting content, but both the sort of pace of the class and the actual tasks kids are asked to do was mostly pretty shallow. And when we ask kids, why are you here? Why are you doing what you're doing? We have to read Hamlet. All the seniors are reading Hamlet, right? There wasn't a sense of purpose beyond that, and maybe save a couple of kids, there wasn't deep engagement with what we were doing. There was a student in this class who happened to be in the student-led theater production that was happening after school. And so the reason we were here is because we were following her for the day because we were interested in that theater production. So we followed her at 2:25 to her theater rehearsal, which, because it was getting close-ish to the production date of this show, was fairly long. I think it lasted from 3 o'clock till 6 o'clock that night. And if you take a look at how time was used in the theater rehearsal, it was completely different from what was going on in that English class. So at the beginning, there was a sort of a buzz. When you walk into that space, the first thing you notice is kids kind of have a sense of purpose. They know what they're doing. Nobody's telling them what to do. They're just going to get, they're going to get they're getting the scripts, they're preparing the scenes, the light is running the lights. Everybody has some job to be doing, and they're doing it without prompting. There's a lot of socializing. There's a kind of sense of energy and anticipation. The director, the adult director, kind of gathers everyone and frames the day, and you could it's like you could hear a pin drop, but not because kids were bored. It's because they were like, okay, let's get to it. And this particular day, they were running the show for the first time without their scripts, which if you've ever been in a theater production, that's a big jump to go from not having a script to having a script in front of you to not. And often what happens is the production quality goes way down before it comes back up, because kids are spending a lot of brain space just trying to remember their lines. And so there was a sense of ooh, my gosh, how is this going to go? You could just feel it. And then for a very long chunk of time, from 4:10 to 6, they're rehearsing. And they're rehearsing with focus, and they're rehearsing with a very coordinated sense of what needs to happen and when. They're pausing at key moments when things don't go well and sort of backing up and getting deep into the questions of what would make this go better. And interestingly, although the director was the one, of course, sort of facilitating lightly, it was really mostly the kids who were doing the stuff, right? The kids are out there performing the play, stopping, saying, hold up, I forgot my line, or let's try moving to the side here. And so there's a lot of involvement on the part of every kid who's in that show, and the director's job is to kind of keep the train on the tracks, but really the director is pretty light touch compared to what the kids were doing. You can see this is the show we call The Servant of Two Masters. So what is it that made this space so different from that English class that we had seen right beforehand? We spent a lot of time in a bunch of different peripheral spaces. So we've also followed a debate team at a very high poverty high school, and we also watched some elective courses, a school newspaper we took a dip into at a different school. So these things I'm about to name, I'm going to describe them in the context of this theater show. But I would invite you to substitute almost any other well-run extracurricular or sort of elective type activity and sort of test whether you think this is true, and I'll give you an opportunity to talk in a few minutes about that. So these are the things that my colleague and I saw as being different between the periphery and the core. So obviously there's the piece around choice, right? So you have kids who have elected to be there, and for whatever reason feel that they have some personal sort of connection with the task being done. And so we'll circle back to what that means when you're talking about core classes, because obviously we're not going to assume that all schools are going to be all elected all the time. There was a very strong sense of community. Kids in this theater production, in general, in the theater program of the school, talked about themselves as the theater kids, right? It wasn't just like I am a person who does that thing. I am a theater kid. It's like core to how I think about myself. And I'm guessing that here, as anywhere, you probably have kids in those categories, the music kids, right? The kids who are the newspaper kids, right? And that's really, that sense of like the connection between your own identity and the thing that you're doing is pretty important in terms of motivation and sort of seeing purpose in your work. Interdependent roles. And so if you think about a regular classroom, right? It's kind of every kid for themselves. I mean, sure, you have group work, but mostly at the end of the day, in most of our schools in this country, you're going to take a test or write a paper and you're going to earn a grade for yourself. And it's kind of independent of what happens next door with that person over there. Maybe they helped you study at best. In a show like this, or a school newspaper, or any other kind of a sports team, if you don't have different kids playing different roles and doing it well in some kind of coordinated way, then the thing that you're trying to create won't happen, or will be much lower quality, right? So in the theater production, everybody knew what their job was. And their jobs were different from each other, right? So the people doing the lights, people doing the costumes, people doing the, people who are out there trying to make sure that everything's coordinated and the lights are following, the people who just made a decision that they're going to step forward at a certain line. All of that has to be working together, and all of it is really essential. And if any of those parts aren't kind of helping out, the show is not going to be as high quality, and in some cases it's going to fall apart. Literally, we watched them for like 10 minutes try to get the lights crew to coordinate with a new choice that they had made about characters, for comic effect. So it's like really important that people are doing different things together in ways that are working. Apprenticeship learning. So in a theater production or any of these other spaces, you often have multi-age kids who are in there, kids who have been doing it for a lot longer, as well as kids who this might be the first show they've ever tried to be part of. And you have the kids who have been sort of more deeply steeped in it, teaching and starting to give some of their skills to kids who are new to it. You also obviously have adults in this space who are themselves participants in this work. So the theater director here was part of an amateur theater company locally. He had his own personal relationship with the domain he was teaching, right? And he also is kind of like gradually handing over the skills and knowledge that he had to the people in the production. And then, the older students or the more seasoned students are doing the same for those who have just recently joined. And so you have ways in which learning is held and given sort of at various notes. It's not just the teacher as the holder of the knowledge, or the teacher as an intermediary between like the physics textbook and you, right? It's like kids teaching other kids, the teacher as a active participant in that field themselves, kind of sharing some of what they know with the kids. And so there's much more of sort of an apprenticeship model of learning rather than a sort of like, I'm gonna dump stuff into your brain. Dave Perkins at Project Zero, some of you may be familiar with him. He has this lovely notion of, he calls it the whole game at the junior level. So he talks about how if you're gonna learn how to play baseball, let's think about like Little League for 6-year-olds. You don't just spend a year learning to bat. You don't just spend a year learning to pitch, right? You play the game at a junior level. It looks kind of chaotic and crazy with 6-year-olds, but it is some approximation of the thing that professional baseball players are doing. And you pause, and you'll have batting practice, and you'll have pitching practice, and you'll run your drills, but all in the context of putting it back together to play the game regularly, so that you actually have a sense of the purpose of what you're doing, right? So when you're thinking about theater, a theater production, the production that these adolescents are putting on is roughly, it's a junior level version of what an actual professional theater group might do, right? They are doing the same parts. There are the same set of roles for this group that there would be in the professional world. They're not doing it as well. There's, some of them are real novices, some of them have some skill, but think about like a junior orchestra, for example. They're still playing the repertoire that a professional orchestra might play, or a school newspaper. They're still producing a newspaper that roughly looks like and has some of the parts of an actual newspaper in the actual world. So, you're not just constantly skill practicing the way that we sometimes do in classrooms. You actually have a sense of what it is you're working toward and why, and how it's connected to sort of the world, the professional domain that task might be connected to. Obviously, there is a public performance of learning, which kind of like gives momentum to the work. And in this case, we happen to follow this theater production from about halfway through to the end. And as the performance got closer, you could just feel the energy get kind of more and more focused and a little bit more frenetic. But kids had a very strong sense that like on X day, curtain rises, we have an audience and we have to be ready and it has to be good. Right, so there's a real sense of momentum. And the last one I'm particularly interested in is uncertainty. So if you think about this group, this theater group and the director, when they started this work toward this performance, they did not know what it would look like at the end. They had a rough sense of it, right? Like we know the script, this play has been performed before, we didn't write a new play. But there is quite a lot of like the sort of ways in which the parts will come together to mount a particular interpretation of this thing is not something that anybody, including the adults, can predict at the beginning. And so everybody has to be kind of willing to live with the fact that they're building something uncertain together, that they don't quite know how it's going to turn out at the end. And I would argue there's something inherently interesting about that, because adolescents want to actually be real parts of something, right? They want to have authentic roles to play. And so when they know, we don't know what we're working toward quite. Think of a school newspaper, same thing. We know that our school newspaper is going to look a certain way, but we don't know what the content's going to be when we start this issue. We have to craft it ourselves, and we have real agency to do that together. That is very different than being told, like, you're going to write the 997th analytical essay about Hamlet that any student has ever written in this space, right? So this is a little slice of data from this project. Rana, would you be willing to read it? Sure.
Interdependent roles in the periphery. Emily, the stage manager. If anyone is out or sick, it puts a damper on the whole process, no matter who it is. You can function, but it's not going to be the best. Interviewer. Interesting. Why is that? Emily. Because every part is crucial. Every person is there for a reason, and we don't have extra people just hanging around. If you look at a stage crew or lights or stuff, everyone is always doing something because they have to, because they have deadlines. And these deadlines aren't flexible, so it's integral that everyone is where they need to be, always. Ben, the director. In theater, it is a community because everyone has a part to do. Whereas if Billy is asleep in the corner of my Spanish class, it doesn't really affect my performance in the class. We're co-constructing something together in theater, but in Spanish, we're not.
So this was, obviously this helped us craft our thinking. This wasn't like, oh, perfect example. This was like researchers use data to inform their theories. But this is, we thought, a really nice illustration of that piece around interdependent roles and the contrast between sometimes how our core academic classes function, where everybody really just feels like they know what they need to do and why, and that, everybody's important. There's no person who can be absent from this space without a consequence. So the other thing that's interesting here, and it's connected to that idea of the whole game of the junior level, is that in the periphery, in spaces like this theater production, assessment is really different than it often is in academic classes in high schools in the US. So first of all, it's the standards of the professional domain that serve as a kind of compass and anchor for how we think about the quality of what you're producing. And so if you think about it, it's possible that not very many of these young actors have been to a live theater production, but they certainly have seen lots and lots of movies, which are a decent proxy for what is a high quality production where you're trying to move an audience and send a message look like. And in fact, probably many of them have seen live theater as well. And so the standards, the sense of we have this intuitive internalized sense of what it means and what it looks like to do good work in this domain, they're there, right? And that's what people are going to use to evaluate that work. The piece around we know what X looks like at its best, similar idea. And then there is, while there is a performance of their learning at the end, a literal performance in this case, the idea of testing along the way and sort of consequencing kids when the test doesn't go well just isn't salient in this thing, right? It's more about coaching toward growth. So if you're up on the stage and you bungle your lines or you forget the thing that you agreed to last rehearsal, it's not like get off the stage or you get a C, live with it, let's move on. It's like, no, we're going to go back and we're going to make sure that we get to where you need to be, and we're going to coach you to the point where you're there, right? So although there is constant assessment of what's going on, sort of self-assessment as well as assessment by the directors and the adults who are helping the show go, the assessment is not for the purpose of punishment and not for the purpose of sorting and ranking people, against each other. It's for the purpose of making the show better. right? So it's about a thing that everybody's collectively part of, not about kind of individual rankings. And then that's connected to that last piece, which is like we have a very individualistic sense of how our schools work, for the most part. Like I said, right? It's very much about, like you think about the way that a lot of high schools, including the one I went to, including some of the ones I've worked for, you know, GPAs and at graduation you get to see, you know, who's the valedictorian and who's the next to valedictorian or whatever you call that. You know, like there's a lot of sorting and ranking people compared to each other. And same thing in classes, what'd you get, who got 100, who got the A, who got the C, right? And so everybody's always kind of elbowing and sort of jostling and seeing where they fit in the grand scheme. And it's because we operate in a really individualistic paradigm, right? It's like everybody gets to sort of accrue individual merit, or so we think, and sort of sort themselves up against each other. Whereas when you're really working towards something collective where everybody matters and people have roles that are interconnected, sure, you know who the most accomplished actors are, and you can look up to them and you can probably identify them. It's not that individual merit doesn't matter at all. But the whole thing, everybody matters, and you know, you take one role out and the whole thing falls apart. And so there's much more of a kind of collectivist sense of what it is we're trying to do together, and that the thing we're producing is bigger than anything any one of us can do alone. And I see that very rarely in academic spaces, where like we're actually building something together that is more than the sum of the parts. So here's a question for you, just because I've been talking for a while. Turn to a neighbor or find a neighbor if you're sitting alone. Introduce yourself if you don't know them. And just for a couple minutes, I want to find out if what I'm saying has any resonance for your own experiences. So you can think about yourselves, or if you want, your child, if you have an adolescent. Think about a non-academic domain where you've been either a participant or you've observed somebody be a participant. And think about those questions about why are they participating? What's their purpose? What were the standards of quality? Like, how do you know what good work is? Where do those come from? How do people get feedback in that space, right? So what does assessment look like? And what are you working toward? What's like the culminating activity or performance that sort of is connected to that domain? So take like, let's say 3 minutes, maybe 1 or 2 minutes first on that. I would love to hear from you, and I just confirmed that I want to make sure we're done by 9:05. So I'm going to move forward, but I invite you to keep having these conversations or share them with me if you're kind afterward. So the question that my colleague Joel and I started to ask ourselves after we had really spent some time noticing this pattern was, why is it so difficult to achieve some of those same qualities inside of the core of schooling? Why are these qualities so much easier and so much more prevalent in these peripheral spaces? And I should say, we don't want to suggest that every single extracurricular and elective course is necessarily inherently going to have rich and powerful learning like this, but many more of them seem to have that than others, and it seems like the sort of the structure and the assumptions that govern those spaces lend themselves more easily to some of those spaces. We've all been in elective classes that are a total bust and a time filler and all of that. So as we asked ourselves that question, we spent some time thinking about sort of the history and the structure of American schools. And so we think about the word grammar. There's a gentleman, Larry Cuban and David Tyack are two scholars of education who came up with this idea that schools have a kind of grammar, like a set of assumptions that governs how they are structured and how time is used and how space is used. And that the grammar or the structure of the academic core in schools, especially high schools, still reflects, as many of you probably already know, kind of the assumptions that they were built with in the early 20th century, right? And so as high schools became a mass phenomenon, as all of a sudden, child labor laws had been passed and we needed a place to put our adolescents, they weren't going straight to the workforce. And we had many more adolescents because we had this huge influx of immigrants and we had like a lot of urbanization. High schools were built with some core assumptions around needing to batch process students, needing to sort students and kind of have some quote unquote efficient ways of getting them through the school and making sure that everybody was kind of doing the things we hoped they were doing. And so we have all of these policies and structures, things like 53-minute periods. Like, who came up with that, right? I mean, maybe that's not true of every school, but we have this idea that subjects need to be separated from each other. Subjects need to happen, once or maybe once every other day for X numbers of minutes. We know, kids need to be ranked on their seat time. We need a certain number of, minutes per subject, per kid, per 4 years in order to tell them that they've graduated. So we have all these things that we do, right? Lockers, bells, there's all these things that we often don't question that have to do with the ways that our schools are set up, which are really kind of antithetical to some of the things we've talked about. Like, think about time, for example, right? If you have 53-minute periods, how deep can you get? Right? I mean, I've been a high school teacher in several different schools, and like even with 2 hours, sometimes it doesn't feel like you can really get the kind of momentum toward inquiry you might want. But when you have 49 or 53 minutes and then schedule B tomorrow, so you don't see the kids till the next day, there's just only so far you can get versus having a 3-hour rehearsal, where kids can get into flow and kids can really start to build some understanding and some technique together. So that's just one of many reasons, right? And if we were in a public school space, I might talk more about policies and testing and all that, but we're not, so I'll skip over that. But those two tend to kind of buffer and constrain what can happen in schools and have some influence over the way that schools operate. And then there's this piece which I would argue I'm guessing might show up sometimes in private schools too, where we have this stance, this set of assumption that governs the academic core. Not every teacher has this stance. In a few minutes, I'm going to share some really shining examples of bridge work that was happening that runs against this. But on the whole, we have some assumptions that we all are kind of swimming in the culture that helps us to internalize these. None of us are as teachers, are maliciously holding these. But it's kind of the way that we ourselves learned in our own schools. It's the ways that we kind of assume, the assumptions we build about what teachers do. And so in the academic core, often the assumption is that what students are learning is settled and certain. There is a body of knowledge, and maybe also a body of skill, that kids need in X domain, and a teacher's job is to get it to them, right? So here's the textbook, or here's the stuff we want, and here's you, and my job is to get this to you, right? I certainly have been, I would put myself first as somebody who has made that assumption in years past about what my job is as a teacher. Also, we have an assumption that learning and the kind of tasks kids can do is very hierarchical and very linear, and that you gotta master the basics before you can get to the interesting complex stuff. And if you don't have the basics, you're not ready for the other stuff. And often what happens is literally it's well, you gotta, know the basics of chemistry, and then when you get to college, if you want to join a lab, you get to do the interesting work. But if you don't put in your time now, kind of, drill your drills and all that, then you'll never be at the point where you can actually do chemistry in a way that's authentic to the field. Now, I would argue, and I will give you some examples that show, I think, that we could disrupt that assumption, and it's a flawed assumption, right? A foundation matters. Certainly, teachers have an obligation to make sure kids have foundational skills. And I have seen a lot of examples of ways that teachers can get kids doing really interesting, authentic, complex work, and also are teaching foundational skills along the way. But often there's this kind of nope, you're not ready for the top of the balloon, so we've got to stay at the bottom. There is, at my own high school, which I would say mirrors the school I described, often a focus on performance over learning. There's a sense my job is to get a grade, my job is to get the highest grade, the higher grade than others, so that I can get into college, become a valedictorian, whatever it is. And the actual learning is not, it's kind of the foreground of my mind. I don't care, as a student, I'm often conditioned to think what matters most is the way that I'm evaluated, not the substance on which I am evaluated. And then, like I said, we have this culture of individualism in our classrooms. So here's an example. This is from Achievement High as well. This was an interview we did with the chemistry teacher. And the teacher, notably here, was very frustrated with this reality, but didn't know how to get out of it. And kids, too, I think, were frustrated. So, Gary, would you read this one for us?
Interviewer, do students think there should be an answer? Chemistry teacher, they want to know what we want. I mean, I think I learned early on that a poker face is really important. It seems to me like there's a lot of students who just learn to read the teacher's faces, and that's what they do. They give a response and they look for the teacher's face. They have this sense that there's always a right answer and that there's always what I want to try and give.
Thank you. I see some smiles and nods, right? Like, so this chemistry teacher, so I put the image because when I teach my pre-service teachers, we talk about playing what's in my pocket and how you shouldn't be playing that, but the like, I have an answer, I'm trying to get it out of you, and you're trying to figure out what it is I want to get out of you. I have done this so many times, right? But this universe where kids are more interested in kind of getting it right than they are in kind of exploring whatever it is, that all of us play that game. All of us have been conditioned to play that game. We're all complicit in that game, right? And I don't think anybody wants to be playing that game. So we heard from a lot of teachers and students at this school that it felt like both of them wanted richer, deeper, more authentic learning experiences and relationships than they had. So it wasn't like they were all happy with the status quo, but they didn't know how to get out of it because they were trapped in this culture of like achievement and scrambling for grades, and teachers felt like parents might actually be upset if they tried to do things differently or moved away from certain practices. So everybody kind of felt very constrained by the various things around them. So the question is, what would it look like if academic classes could have some of the qualities of the periphery at its best? So could take on some of those things that we had seen in theater and in music and in newspaper. What would it look like? What would it be like? And happily, over time, we sort of found classes like that, and we studied them deeply, and we realized actually there are ways to crosswalk and to kind of transform classrooms to be a bit more like what I described. Some teachers are already doing it. I'm sure there's lots of teachers at the school already doing it. It's just not happening yet consistently, and it's certainly not happening as a collective effort, at least in most schools, right? But we found them, so I want to hold up a couple of quick examples. The first one is a Methods of Scientific Inquiry class at a very large urban high school. So this is as non-elite of a school as you can imagine. And the chemistry teacher teaching this course had described how for many years she had taught chemistry. It was like a foundations in chemistry course in a very traditional way. She had done exactly the things we were describing. Here's the body of knowledge. I'm going to transmit it to you. I'm going to quiz you on it, test you on it. And that over time, she realized that, so she had spent some time as a bench chemist early in her career, importantly. So she did, in fact, have a sense of like what the whole game of chemistry was like. Right? She actually had some personal experience of doing chemistry in the world beyond undergraduate. And she realized that that was a huge asset she had not tapped into, and that, in fact, the chemistry she was asking her students to do looked nothing like the chemistry that she herself had done as a bench chemist. And so she started asking herself, like, what could I do to actually make their work look more like a junior level version of actual chemistry, not textbook level, high school level chemistry. And so she redesigned her class, she renamed it, and effectively she turned her class into a year-long inquiry sequence where she was still teaching some foundational chemistry concepts to kids. They had some small numbers of lectures and note-taking every week. It wasn't not part of her class. But importantly, she had her kids group up and over the course of the first 6 months conduct an extended experiment where they were learning how to ask questions that were genuinely interesting to them, look to the literature to try to figure out what is known about those questions, design an experiment to try to answer those questions. Often kids would ask questions that were unanswerable, or you couldn't design an experiment that was, where like it would be very expensive or difficult or logistically complicated to design, so they'd have to go back to the drawing board. Guess what? That's what happens in real science, at least as I understand it. They'd have to negotiate political pressures, like can you use human subjects to do this experiment? Is it ethical? All of those questions. And this was a very long, drawn-out, slow process, very scaffolded, right? So it's not just all happening very fast. They eventually do their experiment. They would write up their results, and then there was a big sort of science fair event at the end of the semester where kids were presenting their work. Now, the questions kids were genuinely interested in asking were pretty simple, right? These are kids who have never been in a chemistry class before. Many of them have lagging foundational skills. So questions like, does it help to listen to music while you study? Or what would have, which is a better way to clean a stain off your, is it better if you spill Coke? Is it better to use vinegar? Is it better to use lemons? Whatever those questions were. They're not, right? They're not actually questions that are like unsettled in the real world. But the process was much more aligned to the world of doing science than what she had been doing before. And she actually gave a lovely analogy. She said, what I was teaching before was like science appreciation. Like we're all, the way music appreciation, you listen to great music, right? Now we're actually doing science together, right? Like we are also learning some stuff, but we are actually like experiencing in some junior level way what it means to do science together. And when you talk to kids and you ask them about the scientific process in this class, their answer was very different than like the canned version of here's the 5 steps of the scientific process that I memorized and put back on my test. They could talk about things like political financial constraints. What happens when you get a null hypothesis? Do you have to go back to the drawing board? They could talk about the fact that it's hard to publish and hard to get people to pay attention to an experiment that doesn't actually yield the results you expected, right? And these are like real life, at least in my understanding of science. They're real life issues for real life scientists in a way that sort of high school level, textbook level science often isn't. And so she was in some ways really sort of engaging kids in some junior level version of the whole game. And as a result, they had a much richer sense of what it was that they were doing and how it was connected to science in the world. This is a more radical example, which I think has many of the same qualities, maybe some more. This is from High-Tech High, where my professional home. So this is at a project-based school where the teacher has fewer of the constraints, still has lots of constraints, but fewer of the ones you might imagine, has more opportunity to work in an interdisciplinary way, longer chunks of time with kids, more capacity to engage in partnerships outside the school. So this is not a sort of generic public school context. This is one of my favorite projects that I have ever witnessed at our school network. It's called the Exonerate Project. It's done by a teacher named Mackenzie King. And effectively, it was done in partnership with the California Innocence Project, which is an organization locally where some pro bono lawyers and law students partner together to look at cases of potentially wrongfully convicted felons, right? So people write petition most of them are incarcerated. They petition to the Exonerate group saying, I was wrongfully convicted. Would you take up my case and try to overturn it? So these 11th grade humanities students, their job throughout this project is to actually become, the Exonerate group is their client, and they actually look at real case files and make determinations about whether those case files are worth taking up as by the Exonerate project or not. And so in order to do so, first of all, they have to understand something about sort of the way that the legal world works. They have to understand a lot of legal jargon. They have to be able to read pretty dense files, right, and navigate the legal language and know who's who and what does it mean when they write about this, that, or the other. So there's a whole sort of vocabulary that they have to acquire. And beyond that, this teacher really frames the project in terms of having kids think about the justice system in the United States and whether the ways in which it is or is not serving its purposes. And so she has the kids read Just Mercy. She has them talk with real exonerees. They go and they visit a jail. There's all kinds of rich discussions, sort of a la any humanities class, about kind of the nature of our justice system and the potential injustices there. But then the central task here is kids in groups are given a case file, and sometimes these case files are like 180 pages long, and they have a whole process they go through to eventually make a decision and then a presentation about whether they think that case file is worth opening. So their exhibition, the performance that they're doing, takes place at the California Western School of Law. And these groups are giving PowerPoint they have PowerPoints and they're giving verbal presentations to the lawyers at the Innocence Project, saying this is the outline of the case, here is where there's no real questions about the evidence, or maybe we don't have enough evidence here, there's never going to be enough evidence to reopen this case, regardless of whether the felon may or may not be, right? So they're making real determinations to a real group of people about these lives. And at the end, they do write an essay, right? They're also working on writing, so they write an essay eventually. The question is the justice system just? And they're invited to draw on the whole body of experience as well as reading that they've done. And the thing about this particular project, I think, is that it's very much aligned. First of all, kids are working on something real. They're deeply aware that they're working on something well. And so I have, I'll just focus on the second quote. There's a student up there who I can't name, who is a student who even at High Tech High, where most of the work is trying to be very authentic, is often disengaged. And in this project, he worked harder than any of us had ever seen him work. And when I asked him why, he said, why do I feel like I need to do well in this project? Because we're just part of something so big, it's like we're holding someone's life in our hands. And so he saw the connection between the incarcerated person, potential felon, that his group was working on behalf of. He really felt like, I have a moral obligation to do this work really well, because this person's fate could have, I could have some impact, real impact on this person's fate. And so the question of why are you doing this? You can imagine when you ask kids in that class, they have very robust answers to that question. Why are you working? Why are you going through these documents? Why are you trying to figure out what this DNA evidence does or doesn't mean? They really understand what they're working toward and why. And so there's a deep sense of purpose. There's a sense of kind of moral gravity there. And quite a number of students at the end of this project were very interested in careers in law and had a much richer sense of what it actually looks like and means to be a lawyer than they had just from watching, any of the law shows that we see, right? Right, CSI, exactly. So, and for example, when I asked some kids about that, they hadn't realized just how much time lawyers spend wading through complicated documents, right? But they do now, and they have some skills to do so, but for some kids that's a turnoff, but for other kids it's okay, I have some real experience that tells me what it might be like if I were to pursue this profession. So, big picture, just to wrap up here. I would argue that there's several things we need to think about, regardless of what kind of school or what kind of classroom you are. I think the piece around connecting what happens in classrooms to the domains and the world beyond school is so important. All the examples where we saw powerful learning and powerful teaching had some real connection between the domain that was being taught and something in the real world that is a version of that thing. The question of what does it mean to play the whole game? I ask myself this a lot because our academic disciplines in high schools are often pretty disconnected from kind of the world of disciplines. In English in particular, I wonder sometimes, okay, we could be preparing our students to be sort of scholars of literature, but there aren't very many of those people, and very few of my students will be that. Are we preparing them to be journalists? Are we preparing them to be filmmakers? English in particular has a lot of different whole games that we can imagine it being attached to, but any one of those is a promising avenue for thinking about sort of connecting more deeply. Breaking down the boundary among disciplines often happens naturally when you're working towards something big. You kind of realize that defining my class as that chemistry class or the social science class, often that kind of will start to happen when you ask those questions. And then I would say the last piece here, so obviously going deep rather than trying to cover a lot is important. But the last piece is sort of around teacher stance, and it's something that I'm always working toward as a teacher and that I likely will never actually get all the way to, but the piece around being more interested and more curious about what kids can do than in trying to control what they do, right? And trying to kind of see our adolescents as really capable, curious humans who want to contribute, and to hang on to that rather than trying to micromanage them in all the ways it just triggers their desire to rebel against us, right? It's so much easier said than done, but it feels incredibly important, and we saw that in all of the spaces where kids were really thriving, were spaces where, there were rules, there was order, but control was not the dominant logic. Learning over performance, right? So being more interested as a teacher or a parent or an educator in what kids are learning and what they're curious about and what they want to get better at, and less interested in what grade they got or what score they got, right? I think kids themselves would like to let go of some of that if they could, and I think we can do our part to help them do that. And then the last one is uncertainty over certainty, right? It's really scary as an educator or a teacher to not exactly know where you're heading. It's much easier and more psychologically satisfying to be like, I know exactly what will happen 8 weeks from now or 12 weeks from now. And it's going to look like X because it's always looked like X, and I have a high level of control. And that's very reassuring, but that does not invite kids into doing authentic work. And when you actually start moving towards doing more authentic work, you've got to be willing to accept some of the uncertainty and to be like, I don't know exactly what we're going to come out of this with. I do know the understandings I want my kids to have. I do know the skills I want them to develop, but the thing we're creating together is not something that any one of us quite knows. And that's what makes it exciting, and that's what makes it engaging for kids, is they can smell it when they have real agency, and they also can smell it when they don't. So I know we're out of time. I'd invite you to, I am on Twitter, and my publicist says I'm supposed to be throwing my Twitter handle more often, so follow me at Sarah M. Fine. Also, we have a book. We have a lot more examples in our book, and I think we're selling it. Is that right?
We have copies here. So, yeah, we sell them in the library or here or at Good Team here.
Yeah, and then I visit High Tech High. I mean, we're neighbors. I would love to learn from you, and I sometimes feel like that it's all too, even in San Diego, the ed worlds are all very siloed, and so I would love to invite some of you to High Tech, and I would also love to invite some High Tech folks here. If you feel like there's some spaces here we can learn from, I think we'd be delighted to do that. So thank you for your time. And